Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation is called The Unusual Suspect. This is a 50-year-old gentleman from Guntur, Andhra Pradesh. He presented with a holocranial severe intermittent headache since November 2020. In early December, he also started to have blurring of vision as well as double vision. Associated with this, his right eye was not able to move to the right side. He was admitted elsewhere and given steroids and aspirin, which temporarily improved his symptoms. In the middle of December, however, double vision and blurring of vision worsened, and he got admitted elsewhere. That time they had done an MRI which showed increased signal density in the clivus and sphenoid sinus. They thought it was fungal sinusitis and started him on posaconazole. At this point, he was also found to be seropositive with HIV too. In early Jan 2021, he developed numbness and decreased mobility of tongue. Here he was started on empirical antitubercular therapy and voice alone. CD4 counts done at this point were found to be 264, and hence he was also started on antiretroviral therapy. In the middle of Jan 2021, there was worsening of the motor power of the tongue and a significant deviation of the tongue to the right side. There was also difficulty in swallowing both liquids and solids, and slurring of speech also developed. And at this point, he came to us in CMC. His past history is only significant for being a known hypertensive for the past 15 years on oral medication. Examination wise, let me take you through only the relevant examination. Neurologically, the sixth cranial nerve was affected on the right side, signified by the right sided lateral rectus palsy. The 10th cranial nerve was also affected on the right side, as the motor component of the right sided gag was affected and sensation at the root of tongue was absent. However, sensory component of gag was present, which was mediated by the 9th cranial nerve. Hypoglossal nerve is also affected on the right side, signified by the deviation of the tongue to the right side. The rest of the CNS and systemic examination were completely normal. Now let's try and localize where the injury is. So if we see there are no long tracks such as the corticospinal tracts or spinothalamic tracts, etc., involved, which suggests that the lesion is extraaxial. So when we talk about extraaxial lesions, we think of meninges dura, ventricles, suprasellar structures such as pituitary gland, pineal gland, etc. But there are also multiple cranial nerves involved, and they are non-contiguous. If we see 6, 10 and 12 cranial nerves are involved. And because there are several cranial nerves running their course along the skull base, logically we thought the localization would be along the skull base. The differentials etiologically considered were infectious. Skull base osteomyelitis was thought to be very likely. Given his HIV status, fungal etiology was thought to be more likely. Inflammatory causes like vaginous, neurosarcoid, IgG4, and neoplastic causes like nasopharyngeal carcinoma, meningioma, or even a lymphoproliferative malignancy were considered. Let's look at the MRI here. On the left side image, this is a mirror image. This is right side for the patient. We can see that in the nasopharynx that there is some soft tissue density. I'm pointing the pointer along where you should be looking. In the right sided image also, the if you can see, compare two different sides, the temporal lobe and the between the skull, there is no soft tissue here, while there is a soft tissue density here. If we look at this particular image, this is the Meckel's cave. This black thing is the normal anatomical structure called Meckel's cave, while here the Meckel's cave appears to be completely obliterated. What is not shown or the good MRI cuts we did not obtain for the extent of the lesion I'm showing here. Like here we can see involvement of foramen lacerum, the carotid canal, the jugular foramen, hypoglossal canal, and here the involvement of the foramen ovale as well. So the MRI brain, as I had previously shown, involved a soft tissue thickening in the nasopharyngeal mucosal space extending superiorly through the foramen ovale and lacerum up to the paracellular region, and in the right hypoglossal canal and right jugular foramen as well. And there was also a circumferential thickening of the sphenoid sinus. Other investigations showed CSF analysis had normal counts, protein glucose cultures, as well as TB PCR. Tissue diagnosis, we obtained a transnasal approach to the middle turbinate because of the nasopharyngeal soft tissue density, but that was also normal. The other tissue sample obtained from the sphenoid sinus and the clivus revealed a high grade B cell non Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now, the learning points I would like to draw your attention to is localizing to the skull base, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma presenting as a skull base lesion, and HIV associated lymphomas in general. So, how do we localize to the skull base? Firstly, there are no long tracks involved, which will put the localization in an extra-axial plane. Now, if we look at the extra-axial plane, if there are contiguous cranial nerve involvements, we can think of extra-axial in the extra-axial brainstem involvement, or depending on what cranial nerves are involved. For example, if it was 3, 4, 6 and V1, we could think of cavernous sinus, but these are incontiguous cranial nerves like 6, 10 and 12 are incontiguous. Then we think about the fact that multiple cranial nerves have a long course in the skull base, and hence considering these facts, we think that it's an extra axial lesion, but because of incontiguous cranial nerve involvement, we think the most likely localization is to the skull base. Now, when we think of skull base lesions, most likely we think of skull base osteomyelitis. However, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma of the skull base is actually an extremely rare presentation of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In fact, only 1 to 2% incidence is there. The patients present with non-specific symptoms and no classical imaging findings to differentiate between tumors. In fact, they mimic other tumors like meningioma with dural tail sign, schwannomas and nasopharyngeal carcinomas if they are localized. And if they are not localized and diffuse, people tend to suspect things like neurosarcoid, vaginous granulomatosis and carcinomatous meningitis. The clinical features are median age at diagnosis is around 60%. The most common subtype is DLBCL, which is around 56% of the skull-based lymphomas, primary lymphomas. The symptoms associated include various cranial nerve deficits depending upon where exactly in the skull-based the um, lesion is, and B symptoms like fevers, night sweats, and weight loss. Now let's talk about HIV associated lymphomas. They differ from lymphoma in the HIV negative population in the following ways. One is they present with advanced disease. They are associated with more systemic symptoms. They have more extranodal involvement, and they are frequently associated with oncogenic viruses like HHV8 and Epstein-Barr virus. So lymphomas that occur in both immunocompromised and competent patients include Burkitt's, DLBCL, Hodgkin's lymphomas, etc. Very specifically in HIV positive patients, primary effusion lymphoma, plasmablastic lymphoma, and lymphoma associated with the Castleman's disease are found. And lymphomas that occur in other immunodeficiency states are polymorphic B cell lymphoma. This is the WHO classification of lymphoid malignancies. So the learning points include in multiple cranial nerve deficits with no long tract involvement, consider extraaxial, and if they are not non-contiguous, then consider a skull-based pathology. Primary skull-based lymphoma is an extremely rare presentation of an extranodal non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It radiologically also masquerades as other common pathologies, and hence a radiological diagnosis is not possible. So tissue diagnosis is what we would go for. And HIV associated lymphomas generally present with more advanced disease, more systemic symptoms, extranodal involvement, and are associated with oncogenic viruses. In our patient, hematology has taken over and they are planning chemotherapy. We have also initiated antiretroviral therapy with dolutegravir, tenofovir, and emcitabine regimen. Thank you.
Thank you, Christianes, for that very crisp presentation and very nice clinical approach. OC sir, would you like to add anything, please?
Nothing much. Janice's presentation was comprehensive. Many learning points from neurological localization to age-related lymphomas. Uh, One thing I would like to emphasize is that this gentleman was treated outside empirically for fungal sinusitis, with skull-base osteomyelitis, tuberculous meningitis, and as best as we could make out, there was no attempt to confirm the diagnosis. So it is very important that we confirm the diagnosis, and we got the correct diagnosis. Uh, he should do well with chemotherapy and antiretroviral therapy. He has no major medical problems, good functional status. So he will most likely be getting something like R-CHOP, rituximab with CHOP and ART. And he has HIV too, which again has a much more favorable prognosis and slow progression of disease when compared to HIV-1. So it is a real challenge, but very gratifying in the end.
Thank you, OC sir. Yes, it did strike me that we chased up and were able to get a diagnosis through the transnasal endoscopic route. I think uh, for 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 the younger group, that's now standard. But I can tell you, in the old days, that would have been very difficult to go transnasally endoscopically. So that was a good thing. Uh, I had one doubt. I was just wondering, how common is it to have a retroviral illness presenting for the first time with a hematological malignancy?
Um, Sir, I'm not sure about the literature, but anecdotally speaking, in this 2 months in medicine 4, we were able to see two malignancies presenting, three lymphomas presenting in seropositive patients, sir, of which only one of them presented as a malignancy for the first time, and then was incidentally discovered to have discovered to be seropositive, sir. But I'm not sure about the evidence. I will read up and get back, sir.
No, that's fine. I think you have answered my doubt that it is not uncommon and we must always keep it in mind. OC, sir, any thoughts on that, or would that be an appropriate
Yeah,
assumption?
AIDS-related cancers are way below opportunistic infections in our country. For us, it's tuberculosis, cryptococcosis, PCP, and protozoal infections causing chronic diarrhea will be much more common. I don't remember the exact incidence in our cohort, but G2 EPEN has done it as his MD dissertation. We have a substantial number. Most common was plasmablastic lymphoma, followed by DLBCL. Um, like Christiana said, mostly extranodal origin. And if the patient can afford chemotherapy and ART, they had fairly decent outcomes.
Uh,
Thank you, OC,
i-
sir. Is there
if
any
I can
other
just
comments?
add, yes, if
Please
I
go
can
ahead.
just add, HIV-2 infection is supposed to be the milder kind of brother of HIV-1, which is a more aggressive type of HIV infection. In fact, some of the HIV-2 who very indolent, extremely slow progressors, we don't even give them ART regimen some of the time. So it's very unusual that this gentleman with HIV-2 infection had come with a stage 4 uh, uh, age-defining malignancy, hematological malignancy. And Christianus, do you remember the CD4 count of this patient?
The CD4 count is 264.
Okay, I think yeah, fairly. I mean, not very low CD4 or as well. So I think it's a very extreme correlation between HIV-2, a decent CD4 count, and age-defining malignancy. Yeah. So
Thank you, Don. Are there any other thoughts or doubts from the audience, please? Otherwise, I'd like to thank Medicine 4 and Christianus for an excellent presentation.